So, formalism. We've all read the Eikhenbaum essay now, and I think at first it's a confusing read, but if you did look at the highlights that I put on and the interpretative comments, it might have helped you. I just want to go over a couple of things here. This is where I'm going to give the kind of lecture part, as it were. So if you look back on page 1 of the text, so Eikhenbaum says the so-called formal method grew out of a struggle for a science of literature. The question for the formalist is not how to study literature, but what the subject matter of literary study actually is. Now this is why we can kind of locate the formalists as the first ever literary theory people. They were the first people to really say, well, how do we study literature? So, and you can see a beginning here. This is a really good quote that you can think about. It says, we wanted to study literature, and here's the quote, through the examination of specific material in its specific context. That's from page 1. Again, if you think about a text, say we have a text here, and we look at it. Now, you don't know anything about this text. It's actually by a guy called Ezra Pound, a famous American poet. But you don't need to, because the formalists would argue that just by looking at the text on the page, that's what matters. The history, the background, how much you know about Ezra Pound, who cares? All we care about is this specific material in its specific context. So what I want you to think about when you're looking at Heart of Darkness and the Bell Jar is, imagine if you were only looking at the words on the page. So in chapter 1 of, say, Heart of Darkness, imagine if you're only looking at the words and how the language is used. We're going to come back to this idea of how language is used in a minute when we talk about Herman Rappaport. But if you look down again, I'm not going to read out all of the quotes that I've highlighted, but just a few of them. So Eikhenbaum's a bit contradictory. He says the essay's not intended to argue our position. Well, that's helpful for us, isn't it, Eikhenbaum? Thanks for that. He does say, however, that we need a science of literature. Formalism was all about having an objective approach to literature. Now, if you think about that, it's not just about saying, oh, I really like the way that character X discusses this, or I like John Milton's presentation of the angels in Paradise Lost. It's all about being specific and focusing objectively on what the author or the writer or the poet or the playwright does. So it's about language. It says here, top of page 2, the empirical study of the material. So it's an attempt to create an independent science of literature which studies specifically literary material. Now this is really interesting. Literary material. The main question I want you to ask you when you look at your extracts for assignment 1 for Sylvia Plath or Joseph Conrad, so that's the Bell Jar or Heart of Darkness, is what about the language of these texts makes them literary? Now, if you use the tools for reading that Herman Rappaport suggests, this is your next reading, you know, you remember he had things like, I don't know, tone or imitation, that sort of thing. We can start to think about the quality of a piece of literature. Now, the drawbacks of formalism, of course, is that it only lets you look at language. So it can be a little bit cold, a little bit sciencey almost. But if you think about it, it has its value because we can all analyse a literary text. So if you're thinking, well, this sounds a little bit too easy, it can't be this simple, actually formalism is. Now let's go down to page 4. We have this wonderful quote, and this is a key term that I want you to focus on. Here we can see just in the middle of the page, Eikhenbaum quotes another formalist. His name is Roman Jakobson. He's another Russian formalist. Now don't worry about citing Jakobson, you can still cite it as Eikhenbaum because it's within Eikhenbaum's text. The quote is, the object of the science of literature is not literature, but literariness. Literariness. That is that which makes a given work a work of literature. So for example, if I take this book by Ezra Pound, okay, it might be literature. It might contain interesting innovations with language. All of the other things we think of as literature, a compelling narrator, a speaker for a poem, some interesting metaphors, an interesting structure or form. And yet, if I show you this here, just this text here, do we think of this as literature? Maybe not. And why not? Maybe it just doesn't have any literariness. So defining literariness is hard, but again, over the course of the lecture, you'll see some ways of doing this. But you just need to understand that literature and literariness, these ideas of finding this quality in literature that makes it stand out from other text, is what the formalists are all about. So again, if we just go down here to the final page, number 5, it says, the formalists did not look, as literary students usually had, towards history, culture, sociology, psychology, or aesthetics, etc., but toward linguistics, a science bordering on poetics. And if you think about it, that's exactly what formalism is. It's all about language. And we all know how to analyse language. Again, similes, metaphors, imagery, juxtaposition, anaphora, analogy, all sorts of different linguistic structures. So your job when you do your formalist reading, again, go to the assignment 1 brief, there's also a little video, is to give the 500-word commentary on the extract it's under the assignments, it's labelled extract. You choose one of the extracts and you give a 500-word commentary where you take some quotes from, say, Eikhenbaum, and you take some quotes from Hillis-Miller, and you take some quotes from Rappaport, and you show me that you can apply these quotes to pick out language features from that extract. So for example, you might say, as Eikhenbaum observes in the formal method, the study of literature is not so much about literature but about literariness. Here, in this particular part of the extract, we can see literariness at play. This simile combined with the metaphor creates a sense of, and this is what's really important, what does it create a sense of for the reader? What's the effect of the language upon the reader? Now that's going a little bit beyond formalism. Formalists were just kind of more interested in looking at the text, but our job is to go and run with it, to identify things using the formalist method, looking at the language, and then to begin interpreting it a little bit. So that's the basics of what Eikhenbaum argues. He argues that he wants a construction of a poetics, or a kind of linguistic study of text that really isn't the same as any other way we look at texts. Now again, if you think about it now, of course, that's really common. That's how we look at a text, we look at the language. But there was a time when people didn't do this. They'd just talk about the text. They'd say, well, how does it relate to religion or history? Now we look at the language, and this is what we're going to be doing in week 1, a close reading.